Welcome to Belling History with the Good Time Girls, a hyper-local podcast about the quirky history of Bellingham, Washington, and the fourth corner of the United States. Even though we like to keep things close to home, these stories are no less entertaining to the masses and those who find themselves, unfortunately, outside of the PNW. I'm your host, Colby, current boss bitch here at Belling History, and today I'm excited to present a very special co-host, the one, the only, Marissa McGrath, founding mother of the Good Time Girls tour business back in 2011.
Oh, it sounds so circa 2011.
Welcome, Marissa!
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
I'm very excited to have you, and hopefully on some more episodes coming up soon as well.
TBD.
We're working on it. We're kind of pulling this one a little bit out of our
Keisters?
ears. I paused for a moment there. Where did we pull it out of today?
But it's great. I'm really excited to talk about this subject.
Okay, so today's episode is called Ursula Unfug, Poor Unfortunate Soul.
Yes.
As in The Little Mermaid?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But this Ursula is a little...
She's a landlubber.
A little different.
Yeah.
Not quite as octopusy. But yeah, content warning on this one today. This episode's stories contain the topic of domestic violence and also suicidal ideation. So listen with care.
Yes.
And we'll try to warn you when that's coming up. So today's story is about a woman whose amazing birth name was Ursula Unfug, who was a sex worker in the PNW, who lived and worked in brothels in Fairhaven and in New Whatcom, or what was going to become Bellingham, around 1890 when those boom towns were booming. And Ursula gained notoriety after shooting her abusive asshole lover / secret husband in December of 1892. His name was Thomas Henderson Boyd, and he was editor of the Olympian newspaper, and he came from a well-off railroad family back east. So newspapers in the region had a heyday with this sordid story and just absolutely vilified Ursula, at least at first. And soon a tragic tale of exploitation and abuse emerged, which turned the tide of public sympathy as much as one could have for such a quote-unquote fallen woman at the time.
So the crime that our story centers around actually occurred in Seattle. So the crime didn't actually occur right here in Bellingham, but this one was close enough to home that we thought it was appropriate. It was in a rooming house run by Mrs. Lily Kennedy at 310 James Street. So that's between 3rd and 4th in Pioneer Square. So near Gessler, completely surrounded by the Tenderloin, or the first Skid Row that was in Seattle. And it was full of vice and what was called low entertainment. So witnesses in the boarding house heard 4 pistol shots that were fired. The police reportedly found a hysterical woman clinging to the lifeless body of Tom Boyd, who was covered in blood. He still had a half-burnt cigar in his mouth. One account reported that she was pulled away and that she was screaming frantically that she loved him. Upon examination, it was found that there was a bullet that had entered his left temple and another just below his navel, and that 2 other bullets were embedded in the walls. And the Seattle PI reported that Thomas Henderson Boyd, editor of the Morning Olympian, was shot and instantly killed by his wife in her rooms at 10:15 o'clock last night. The tragedy is the outgrowth of an unhappy secret marriage, which was unknown to nearly all of his most intimate friends. A bitter quarrel in the evening reached a climax when he taunted her with the fact that she had been a courtesan, and she renounced her love for him. He flung out of the house and caroused from one saloon to another. At last, stung with remorse, she went in search of him, found him, and took him back to her rooms. The quarrel broke out anew, and they had no sooner entered their room than in a fury she fired 4 shots at him, 2 of them taking effect, killing him instantly.
As you know, we love to read ye old-timey newspapers, which again are, it's this era of yellow journalism. It's very clickbait. There's a lot of very sensational stories, sensational headlines. You gotta kind of take it with a grain of salt. So the apparent murderer was Ursula Unfug, which that name, I'm just part of what stuck out to me was this name because it's so unique. There's no one else, I don't think, with this name. In most articles, they referred to her as quote-unquote Gypsy Ashton or other aliases she used as a sex worker. And because of our current understanding of that as often derogatory term, we're going to err on the side of not being offensive and just call her Ursula or Ashton. That was the surname of one of her former lovers called Billy Ashton. He was a noted gambler, was the surname she used often in the PNW here. So let's back up a little bit. Marissa, can you set the stage for us?
Yeah, so in general, the entire Pacific Northwest region at the time of our story in the 1890s was pretty Wild Westy. The population skewed really male and young. That's why we see so many brothels, saloons, shenanigans. That's the norm. And that had been the way across the West for the last previous few decades at this point. Mining towns and camps and railroad outposts were all interconnected with a transient population of like sporting types, gamblers, sex workers, outlaws. I mean, we really were the Wild West. The Transcontinental Railroad, the Northern Pacific, was completed all the way to Tacoma in 1883. Washington had just become a state only 3 years before this murder in 1889. And the city of Seattle had also, the same year, 1889, had this huge fire in June and was rapidly rebuilding. Seattle's population grew just within the decade of 1880 to 1890 from about 3,500 to 42,800, so almost 43,000. And by the early 1890s, and by the early 1890s, the city was substantial enough to attract its own transcontinental railroad. This is the Great Northern. This is just giving us some context about just like the influx of people and what we're seeing and who's coming out here. Meanwhile, up here in Bellingham Bay, we had the rival towns of Fairhaven and New Whatcom. We talked about how Ursula had worked in both and that wouldn't become Bellingham again for another decade. So we're still, at this moment in time, it's two very separate towns. And they were also building their own little railroad lines and having their own little booms.
Yeah, so those of you who are familiar with our tours and things, a lot of our stories come out of this era because that's when things were really wild and crazy here. Yeah. Lots of brothels, lots of saloons.
Arguably more women like Ursula
than
women not like Ursula.
Yeah, exactly. The population was leaning heavily male and young. So at the time of the murder, like I said, most newspapers villainized Ursula and really pounced on all the scandalous stories of her past and pretty much called for her to be strung up. And they also at the same time kind of painted Boyd as like respectable but kind of foolish man who had fallen under her spell. So just to give you a sample of some of the choice words that they used, the Seattle PI said, quote, "The woman, a notorious ex-member of the demi-monde, hunted Boyd to slay him." And about Boyd, they said, "The victim is a well-known newspaperman and member of an excellent family." The Weekly Missoulain called Ursula a cast-off creature, a Mexican girl who had graduated in every vice and ruled every dance hall from Leadville, Colorado to San Francisco by her fatal beauty.
I don't like how they said Mexican there.
Yeah, which Ursula herself kind of played up this like idea that she was either Mexican or Spanish.
Right.
So,
we can talk more about that, but you can just feel the emphasis on Mexican as feeling like a verging on a slur.
Yeah, for sure. And they called Boyd one of the most genial of men who fell a victim to her fascinating wiles and married her in hopes of reforming her.
Huh.
Did he now?
We'll see.
Did he now? Okay. They said, quote, "She led him in a merry dance, then killed him. He deserved a better fate."
That's true of everyone who's ever been murdered, I would say.
Yeah, sure. I mean, we can say that. We can say that. But did he, though?
We'll find out.
Yeah, we'll be the judge of that in a little bit here. So, an article in the Tacoma Daily called her a, quote, "olive-skinned black Castilian." Again, with the racial emphasis thing there. And a pretty dark-eyed Jezebel. They said, quote, "Boyd lived the life of most young men who are sent to this coast by respectable Eastern parents. The foolishness of this policy has often been illustrated before, but never more forcibly than by this dreadful crime. To throw a reckless boy into a country far removed from his home, where no pride of family or restraint of convention can hold him from excess." Which I think was pretty typical of what was going on. You did have a lot of young people who were far away from home, surrounded by saloons and brothels, who were kind of getting pretty crazy.
What did they call us in those days? Unchurched. There was just not a lot of proper society. There wasn't a lot of things telling you about how you should behave, and people were had come from these really like rigid communities where they probably knew everybody.
Right.
And there's in some cases in small towns, and they come out here, and it's like being on spring break.
Exactly. They then said, every effort will now be put forward to save Boyd's murderess from the punishment which she deserves. She will be treated as if she were a much wronged woman, whereas the fact is she victimized Boyd in every way that she could. As all reports indicate, she was nothing better than a tiger. Such women are the most dangerous element in society, and this girl's beauty and power of fascination made it possible for her to lead astray truer men and better than Thomas Henderson Boyd. Poor fellow, he is gone. The career of a clever man has been cut short.
Man alive. I feel like I can feel this guy smugly pulling this piece of paper out of his typewriter after he wrote that and being like, I've done it! You know, like, the readers are gonna love this. They're gonna eat it up. I understand the pull to want there to be like a clear good guy and a clear bad guy, and how they just want to paint her, like they're calling her dark, that context of, you know, she might seem beautiful, but she's really a black widow.
And they're otherizing, and the whole thing, it's just, this one kind of really depressed me when I was going through and reading it, because it was so much.
Yeah, exactly. Oh yeah, there's more. So the Olympia Tribune dramatically wrote, the killing of Thomas Henderson Boyd by a prostitute who termed herself his wife is almost without a parallel. A more heinous or ungrateful murder has never blackened the daily press. After spending her life in reckless prostitution and dissipation, after gracing the police records in all the principal cities and towns of the Pacific Coast, after perpetrating almost every crime known to modern adepts, she wantonly slays the only man who perhaps ever tried to lift her from the depths of sensuality, all because she thought he had ceased to love her. Wow.
There's a lot of writing like that, too, where it's almost like, were you in her head?
Yeah, they seem very much like they are. And because multiple papers, the Seattle PI, I mean, there's many examples here that we found that are the same kind of language over and over again.
Yeah. Poor Tom Boyd, who's just this, like, wayward, you know, boys will be boys kind of a thing.
Well, up until now, we don't have any
like
information.
A tiger.
Yeah. Up until now, we don't have any information to the counter.
Yes, no, we do not. So what we know about Ursula's background. As always, it's pretty much a puzzle to tease out truth from fiction, because especially a woman in her situation are using false names, they're using aliases, they're lying about their backgrounds, their ages, constantly. So, from one paper to the next, there's a different story about where she's born, what her background is. Even though she's often called Mexican or Spanish, it appears she wasn't, though I cannot confirm her parentage. Her father was most certainly German.
Yeah. Unfug certainly does not sound very Spanish.
Name. No, and there's not very many Unfugs in the country.
I have never
in the
met
United
an Unfug.
States. And they're a bunch of brothers that all immigrated together at the same time, and then all their descendants. But so at the time that she's born, there's 3 or 4 brothers. So
there's a possibility she could have a Mexican mother.
Her mother could be, but there are lots of people saying like, no, her mom's just a white lady.
The thing we know about women sex workers is there was often a desire to set yourself apart and separate and different. We also know about the concept of exotic eroticism.
Exactly.
This concept that somebody is more attractive if they're somehow different.
Yes.
We know of stories of women putting on fake accents in brothels.
Often they'll say they're French.
Yeah, more commonly
that's
French.
Sexy.
Right, yeah.
But also, the Spanish, the dark, dusky maiden is exoticized. And
right, exactly. And you could, of course, there's all kinds of ethnic groups from Europe that could also give you duskier complexion and dark hair. So if she's described that way. And so it could just be that. And then, again, this feels really icky to our modern brains.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, that was just basically like her brand, if you will. That was how she was branding herself. So in the newspaper, they said, the murderess, according to her own statement, is 22 years of age, and she said she was born in Chihuahua, Mexico, and was a full-blooded Spanish woman, and they had her maiden name, Ursula Juanita Unfug, and she at the time claimed both her parents were dead. So Name and age, those are correct as far as I can tell. But the rest doesn't seem to be true at all. Her parents were not dead, but she was about 22 years old at the time of trial. So she's not very old.
No, that's quite young.
Yeah. And the name Ursula Unfug is, like I said, this is a very unique name. One of these brothers, these Unfug brothers who emigrated from Prussia, is undoubtedly her father, although which one remains a mystery. I found her in the 1880 census in St. Mary's Boarding School for Girls in Denver, Colorado. Okay. Now, this was kind of a prestigious school. It wasn't like a reform school.
Right.
And so she was 10 years old. Okay. Somebody's paying for her to be educated there, would be the case. And her race is listed as white and her birthplace, Missouri.
Okay.
And this is the only census record she appears in. There's no 1890 census, because they all burned in a fire. And I haven't found any birth records, no marriage records for her parents. I don't think they were married. I think she was illegitimate. That would explain this whole situation.
Gotcha.
But they could exist, and I just didn't find them. That's also possible.
And it was common at this time, too, for, like, you know, a moneyed father could set up the kid with a good education. It would just consider it's upper classes. This is exactly what they would do with these situations.
And it is unclear. Like, I mean, she's carrying his surname,
right.
So she is acknowledged on some level, and the school is being paid for. Mm-hmm. So it would be interesting to know more about that. Unfortunately, it's just a very hard thing to research. So the most useful information in trying to research her came from an interview in one paper with a detective who said he first saw her in 1879 in Leadville, Colorado, when she was around 9 years old. So her mother, unfortunately, is not named anywhere other than like Mrs. Burns, which was one of the men she was reportedly married to, was Mr. Burns.
I'm just imagining The Simpsons.
It was said both mother and her daughter Ursula worked as waitresses in concert halls. So this is like, it's very much like a step from there up to being a full sex worker, but it's kind of like your stepping stone kind of situation.
It's like the cigars, cigarettes girl live later.
It's your saloon girl
totally.
Of the Old West movie. It's said that her mother lived in Alma, Butte, and Spokane. Unclear whether she was still working as a waitress. She's also said to be running lodging houses. All of that sounds pretty sus, like she's in the business on some level also. And he called her a fine-looking woman who didn't appear much older than her daughter.
Ew.
So she probably wasn't very old when she gave birth to Ursula either. And then the detective also said, quote, her father, I have heard, was a wealthy coal man at Walsenburg, Colorado, which, surprise, surprise, several of these Unfug brothers settled in that area.
Interesting.
And were doing well for themselves in the mining industry. And it would seem likely then, of course, that one of them's paying for her education. And it's said that Ursula spoke several languages, including French, Spanish, and Italian.
Wow.
And she played several instruments, including piano, guitar, and mandolin.
So interesting, because it's like she's got all this education, but really early on, she's like a working girl.
Yes.
She's 22, but she's been arrested a bunch of times before and lived in a bunch of cities, worked in a bunch of cities up and down the coast. By the time she gets arrested when she's 22 and murders her potentially second, like, long-term partner. She's lived a lot of lives. It actually, I say this because it also is a good reminder that we think of adults as, and women that would begin working in this world as like starting when they're 18, but that's undoubtedly not what was happening here. And she may have learned those languages at that school.
Definitely.
But maybe for some reason is not able to stay there, isn't able to continue her
I would
education.
guess she wasn't there for too much longer. She might have stayed till like age 12,
right, and
13.
And I could see at a place like that you'd learn those languages, and being able to speak those languages could help you with your alias that you've created.
And it would give you a kind of an elevated status in the sex working world. Like you would be more likely to be in a parlor style brothel where you're dealing with a higher level clientele who would appreciate those skills and things like that. So
absolutely.
And we do know her mother was alive and not dead because she came for the trial.
But no Unfug showed up?
Nope. and never mentioned. So whoever the
Interesting.
father was, he really managed to keep any, like connection to this very sensational crime that was absolutely being reported in Colorado and all around there. Like, not every newspaper is digitized, so maybe there's something somewhere, but...
I think this is a great evidence that he's one of these coal men in Colorado because he could have had means to keep himself
Absolutely.
out of the situation. Have my lawyer call them and tell me to keep me out of this.
Yes. Exactly. So that definitely stuck out to
He's
me
like,
because...
unfug me from this situation.
Yeah, because even like Thomas Henderson Boyd's family,
Mm-hmm.
I looked in his home state newspapers to see like what were people saying about him. And it was also obviously like kept very on the down low there because they were a very prominent family and they had the ways of doing that.
Interesting. So at the time of the trial, Ursula's 22, like we said. She's also described as being 5'2" and weighing 135 pounds. I don't know why they felt like everybody needed to know that. And many sources did play up her beauty and talked about her exotic looks and flashing dark eyes. But they also emphasized her violence and with her as a perpetrator. Not all agreed that she was good looking, which I love. How much time and energy male-dominated spaces will spend on trying to decide if a woman is attractive or not.
Yeah.
This is like
Yes.
a tried and true American pastime. And we're going to see it play itself out in some more quotes here. So, while intoxicated, she was a regular she-devil. She was reckless to the extreme and always carried a pistol and a knife and never hesitated to use either. While sober, she was, though not a handsome woman, particularly fascinating and was never at a loss for friends. It sounds like she had Riz.
Yes, exactly.
And we do have a great picture of her. It's of Ursula.
Yes, we'll put this in the show notes.
Yeah, and when I say picture, I mean
it's
etching.
a drawing.
Yeah, there's an etching of her. She's got those like really curly bangs.
The
that
big
kind of,
poof.
The poof bangs in the front, the hair pulled back. She's got matching earrings and necklace set on, a roughly square neck kind of collar, but her shoulders seem to be bare.
It's hard to tell.
Yeah, I've decided her shoulders are bare.
I know. I had that same first impression and debated it. Like,
Yeah,
is
she's
she...
cut off just below where the cleavage would be. But I think, of course, they would want to show her in something that at least implied that it would be her working girl's uniform.
She's not portrayed in like a high collared, which most women would be wearing something that absolutely covers you up to the top of your neck.
Absolutely.
so yeah.
They're trying to really show her in her like showgirl look.
Mm-hmm.
The newspapers gleefully printed anything that they could find about her life. And, talking about the escapades she had in the brothels that she worked in. This all happened between 1885 and 1892. So she'd been working in brothels across the West since she was a teenager.
So if she was 10 in the 1880 census, let's say.
So she was 15 in 1885. So in Butte, she had worked in a brothel on East Park Street. That district was, women that worked were called the Ladies of the Line or the Park Street Girls. She had gotten into a knife fight there with another Lady of the Line. After coming out here, she was reportedly first in Portland, and then in what was referred to as an inmate at the Bagnio, which was kept by Nettie Howard in Olympia.
I had to look that word up because they use that a lot for brothel.
Yeah.
It's a weird word. So.
And Nettie Howard's a cool character. Shout out to Olympia. There's a mural to her. She married the mayor. So she was a African American woman who was the most successful brothel owner in Olympia, and there's a mural dedicated to her in downtown. She married the mayor.
Go Nettie.
It really just shows how different things were back in the day.
Yes.
In Maddie Lowry's place is another place that Ursula worked in, and over the Montana Stables in Seattle, and at Lottie Clark's house of ill fame over the Grotto Saloon in Port Townsend. If anybody out there knows where the Grotto Saloon is in Port Townsend, we are trying to figure it out. They said that she lived here about 6 months and gave frequent exhibitions of temper. On one occasion, while inebriated, she chased 2 young men down Union Wharf with a huge dagger. She wielded the weapon with the ferocity of a maniac. The men escaped by climbing over a high board fence. She is well known among the sporting fraternity. And Portland also reported that Mrs. Boyd's career is well known among a certain class in the city. Rude. She came here several years ago and took up quarters in a house on 6th Street. She always dressed in the height of fashion, and her attire, together with her striking beauty, okay, I guess she's hot again, made her the subject of much notice on the streets. One night, the police were called in to quell a disturbance. After imbibing 7 bottles of wine, she had become intoxicated, and some imaginary insult from her male companion aroused all the 5 fire of her Castilian temper. There it is. And glasses and dishes flew promiscuously. When the officers arrived, she had secured possession of a carving knife and was about to plunge it into the breast of her companion. It was with some difficulty that she was controlled. Ashton's career in this city became so notorious that she left and went to the Sound. In describing Ursula's time on Bellingham Bay, local papers said, Fairhaven and New Whatcom should also be included in the list of towns in which Ashton led her life of shame. She was an inmate of Belle Arlington's Bagnio. Later, she became one of the principal attractions of May Wright's resort, where she considerably enlarged the circle of her acquaintances, which included many men prominent within the political, professional, business, and social circles of Bay cities. Can we please pause and break down how juicy this is?
Yes. Of course we can.
So we've been talking about different people in Portland and Olympia and what, and they're neat, but this is about us. So we need to slow down. So can you talk about Belle Arlington's Bagnio here?
Yeah. And again, Bagnio is just some kind of weird, it's another euphemism for brothel. You can look up the etymology of it if you want to. But Belle Arlington had a brothel in Fairhaven during the 1890s. Of course, May Wright, we talk about her a lot on tours. She had brothels in both New Whatcom and Fairhaven. She was the only woman on the list of the first telephone subscribers in town. And she was a property owning woman she was around for at least about a decade.
And she liked technology.
Yes.
That's great. For everybody else that's listening, where were May Wright's resorts?
Yeah, so there was one in Fairhaven down in the vicinity of Mackenzie and 9th Street, down where the big tennis club is down there in that area. And then also in New Whatcom, you'll see it in a lot of old photos of like the Whatcom Museum and the Whatcom Creek area, because that old City Hall building that is now part of the Whatcom Museum is often the focal point of photographs, and her brothel sticks out like a sore thumb because it's a 3-story house and it's painted very dark color, so it looks black.
Looks black, and we don't know. I've always hoped it's painted bright red.
Like it's hard to know from black and white photos.
Right. I feel like that was another way of marketing, of making it very clear, because you could say, I'm going to be in Bellingham. Oh, go to there's a big black building.
Yeah, the big tall black house.
Right. That's where you're going to go.
So it's on D Street. There's condominiums there now overlooking Maritime Park.
Okay.
So that was right where it was.
Oh, yeah.
It looks very different now. Everything's been filled in around the creek a lot. So.
Yeah. And where her brothel was in Fairhaven, where we talked about the tennis club that's there now, that whole area was quite brothely as well. That was like, Fairhaven never had a red light district, but if they did, that's kind of where it would be.
mean, that was their red light district. Essentially, they didn't have it like written into the city charter like Whatcom had. But...
Right. It was the unofficial. Okay, great. Thanks for that little aside.
Of course. They also reported on an incident in a Fairhaven saloon. So this was in July of 1891. This was in the newspapers in Fairhaven and was taking place at the Tontine Saloon.
So the Tontine is in the heart of Devil's Row, so 11th Street in Fairhaven, which is near the alley where the old British telephone booth is.
Yes.
For locals. And there is a marker there that says the Tontine Saloon Spider Biles was nabbed here in 1892. So this is, if you remember, there's a great Spider Biles episode.
Yes, go back and listen to that. So I'm gonna read this quote from the Fairhaven Herald. The Tontine Saloon was the scene of what might have been a homicide, but for the great good luck and quick action on the part of a bartender who was the one assaulted. It seems Miss Ashton, the frail female who was mulcted in Judge Clark's court yesterday for being drunk, in the course of her bibulous peregrinations...
Wow.
Blech. Okay, I said it. Went into the Tontine at an early hour Monday morning and ordered the bartender to give her a drink, and on his refusal she made things exceedingly lively from the word go by throwing a glass at his head and following it up with a cigar lighting lamp, which she launched in the same direction. She missed her mark on both shots and then endeavored to become possessed of a revolver, which she knew was contained in one of the drawers back of the bar. Failing this, she was induced to suspend hostilities and leave the house, which she did, only to return a few minutes later with a, quote, self-cocker, I think that's a gun, of the most approved pattern, and proceeded to call the turn on the bartender, promising to fill him full of holes. The mixologist, however, was quick enough to spoil her intentions, and after a scuffle, she was disarmed and locked up, with the finale of $5 in costs.
Gasp.
She may thank her stars that she had not a more serious charge to her account than that of being drunk.
Well, I would venture to guess that $5 would have felt like a lot of money to a lot of people, but probably not somebody in Miss Ashton Ursula's profession. I just want to say that when someone is mulcted, that means they're fined in the judge's court. They have to pay a fee or fine. And that peregrinations,
I think.
It's our long winding journeys. Okay. So less Googling that other people have to do there.
Thank you, Marissa. So there you go. Fairhaven papers also told the story of her affair with a local city councilman. And they said, quote, she led a wild life here and was the favorite of a number of men of more or less prominence who were frequenters of the houses of which she was an inmate. And so they said Councilman Kinghorn became infatuated with her and she became his mistress. He supported her in such style that he had to use money of his insurance company of which he was agent.
Amazing.
Yeah. So his name was Frank J. Kinghorn. He was born in Australia. You cannot make these things up.
I know the names.
Frank Kinghorn, in his late 20s during this time in Fairhaven.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it's like this guy, who knows if he had any kind of political experience whatsoever. He just was here and willing to do the job.
Right.
He was sitting on the city council next to, J.J. Donovan at this time.
Interesting.
Yep.
And for people that's the man on the bench in downtown Fairhaven, who was also just a very prominent local businessman.
Definitely a lot more straight.
Right. Very Catholic.
Mm-hmm. So here's a few other things local papers had to say about Ursula. They said, though a passionate and dangerous woman, she is by no means bad at heart. Among those who are familiar with her career, stories of her kindness and generosity are current. They also said that Boyd visited her occasionally when she was in the town and that she talked freely of being in a relationship with him and that saying they were married.
Well, let's talk about Boyd, because I think we have talked plenty about Ursula.
Yes,
we have understand her better. But we've done a little bit of eyebrow waggling at the idea of him being such a great guy, and you're going to find out why. So,
what do you think of these pictures of him?
I cannot get over them. So the way to describe these pictures of Thomas Henderson Boyd, who I'm going to call Tom or Tommy or Boyd, is he looks like when you see an old-timey baseball player and you're like, how can this person play baseball? He has like a waxed pointy mustache, not the curly kind, but the pointy at the end kind. He has one of those stupid parts where like your hair doesn't part down the middle, but it's the 1890s, so you have to force it to try to part that they all did. You know what I'm talking about?
Yes, I can see it right here.
He's got a little bit of a receding hairline. He's just a kind of boring looking dude. He's got a very high starched collar. He has an ascot on rather than a tie, and he's kind of got a long broad nose. He's kind of got a dopey look to his face.
He's giving me dickhead vibes.
Yeah, you're getting more dickhead than dope.
Yeah, both. I mean,
a dopey dickhead.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I think we can agree, and I think that's going to be borne out by the evidence. So, so one of the papers at the time printed the summary of Boyd that I just want to start with. So the murdered man was 35 years old and came from one of the best families in Philadelphia and received a good education. His father is Colonel Augustus Boyd, a very wealthy man, and one of the vice presidents of the Pennsylvania Railroad. OMG. That's a big deal. Like, that's monopoly money, literally. Pennsylvania Railroad. Boyd's first appearance on the Sound was in 1882. He came out then a passenger on the ship Admiral from Philadelphia, which brought out cargoes of railroad iron for the Northern Pacific to Tacoma, which I just want to point out, when someone isn't going on a passenger ship from Philadelphia at this time in history, that means they're going all the way down the Horn of South America. We're talking pre-Panama Canal. And it's like a 4 to 5 month journey that he took to get out here. So he really wanted it. After a short stay here, he went to San Francisco and organized a traveling variety show, which is a real sharp turn. Which, it's interesting because I'm like, how did he get mixed up in this Viceland? And like, this is
there you go.
Which he took the traveling variety show on a tour through the Pacific Coast towns. The venture was financially unsuccessful, you don't say. Boyd lost $25,000 of his dad's money, and he returned east and followed.
That's a lot of money now.
I mean, yeah. I mean, we're talking Pennsylvania Railroad people, though. Like, yeah. I'd be very interested to find out if his father knew that was what he was investing in. When
probably not. Can you imagine? He's like,
I'm going to start a bank. He returned east and followed the newspaper profession as a reporter. He again came west, arriving in Tacoma in 1888. So he has a trade now.
His dad's like, get your ass back home. You're going to work for the newspaper.
Mm-hmm. I can get you a situation at the newspaper that I own.
Yeah, exactly.
So So he was a reporter at the Ledger in Tacoma, and he was there about a year. And then in December of last year, that would have been 1891.
He worked at a whole bunch of newspapers in the area.
Yeah, so that's when in 1891, he purchased the Olympian, which is still the newspaper in Olympia to this day. So he didn't run it completely into the ground, although I have heard people from Olympia call it the Daily Zero because of the O. It's not the most appreciated paper these days. That all checks out. Boyd was a rich kid from back east. He was sowing his wild oats in the West. He's a decade plus older than Ursula, but that wasn't that uncommon at the time. He was described as 5'10" and weighing about 150 pounds, so I guess they were telling that about men too. It is said that he dressed showily, but in good taste, and would have attracted attention anywhere as a man of energy and good birth and breeding. Right. Despite most papers initially portraying him as a sympathetic victim, they increasingly noted his shortcomings. They said his personal acquaintance was particularly large throughout the state, but he had very few intimate personal friends. He was a bundle of mannerisms that gave him an affected air. He had a peculiar nervousness that kept every muscle in his body in constant motion. It sounds like he had a lot of energy.
This is giving me tweaker vibes a little bit.
Oh yeah, the pre-tweaker era.
And like he's doing the cocaine tooth drops or something.
Oh yeah, that's a good point. He was a good conversationalist and made friends easily and could have gone into the best of society. Drink and fast women had such fascination for him that his family were glad to have him remain in the West. So they're basically like...
You're embarrassing us.
Yeah, just stay out there.
Stay over there. We'll keep it out of the papers if we can back here.
They also discussed that his business affairs were messy and he was secretive about his finances, except when making overtures to officials and political aspirants for financial assistance. Oftentimes it seems that these overtures for financial assistance were strengthened by a little blackmail.
Yes.
So we're going to talk more about that.
This was his whole thing. Yeah, in fact, Boyd had been pissing people off for at least a good year or two before she shot him. Great. So he made an enemy out of Colonel William Lightfoot Vischer, who was editor of the Fairhaven Herald. Vischer was like a really colorful and interesting character in Fairhaven history, though he didn't stay very long. He was 58 years old when he lived in Fairhaven. He was already nationally known as a newspaperman, poet, lecturer. He had published volumes of poetry, novels, melodramas. He was a celebrity.
Yeah.
He was from Kentucky. He fought for the Union in the Civil War. He actually earned a law degree, but seemed to prefer the liberal arts. He had a big bulbous nose and a bushy mustache, and he has this big wide-brimmed felt hat, and he liked to drink whiskey, and was described as always smiling as though amused at a private joke.
That's great. Well, he was one of the only old people in town.
Yeah. And he had a wife and a teenage daughter at the time. And his wife was also an artist and performer. And later in life, she did palm readings as Madame Vasha.
Oh, great. Like Vischer, but like with more of an...
I thought that was so funny. They also didn't always appear to be living together. So
cool.
There's that. They had very vaudevillian vibes also, like did a lot of traveling and giving talks and theaters.
More like bohemian.
Totally. Yeah. Exactly. So that's Vischer. And in 1891, he had published this long rant in the Fairhaven Herald about Boyd and his politics and his tendencies towards finding dirt on people and using it against them.
Like as a writer, like as a reporter,
yes,
Boyd's self. Okay.
And so they're rival newspaper guys at this point, right? And basically Vischer's like, this young upstart shit-faced motherfucker. Yeah. So he says, quote, "The malodorous T. Henderson Boyd, who is known by those who know him best to be an utterly insincere, irresponsible, treacherous, lecherous traitor." Love that. Treacherous, lecherous traitor to those who have befriended him, and a common prostitute in the calling of journalism that he disgraces. And he goes on to talk about how he had written this long and lying letter to the Seattle PI. And so in the same month, there's other newspapers are kind of also commenting on this same situation. Mm-hmm. And this is in the Kettle Falls Pioneer, which said, "Recently the Pioneer had occasion to puncture a sham known by the public men of Washington as Thomas Henderson Boyd. The Fairhaven Herald has since designated him a prostitute in journalism, and the Olympia Tribune has styled him a shyster and a fraud."
I like that they really want, just so you guys know, people are calling him a prostitute in journalism.
All the newspapers are saying shit.
That phrase really resonated with them.
Yes, it did. And they said he responded by denouncing the Pioneer as a vandal, and they're like, Be it so. The pioneer would prefer to be known as a vandal rather than a despicable creature who possesses no other ability than the faculty of creeping into the confidence of reputable people for the purpose of betraying and misrepresenting them to advance his own interests. The pioneer is loaded for bigger game, but if this little thing persists in standing in range of the guns, he is liable to be knocked down again by the concussion.
I feel like these are the same newspapers that later on are like, oh, he was a good guy who got murdered
crazy.
by a terrible woman.
Yes, it's crazy.
So what is it that he sent? There's
a
lying letter that he sent to the PI about Vischer?
It was about other politicians. So he's enmeshing himself in politics and he's trying to get dirt on everybody and then use it against them in getting money, essentially. He's trying to blackmail people and also influence politics. And guess who he's using to do this?
Yeah, his sweetie. Yeah. So, okay, but let's get to the trial. The trial was delayed multiple times because Ursula was unwell. She was unwell because she had miscarried, and that was confirmed by her attending physician, Dr. Edward James Crichton, who, as I know, we have pictures of him. He's weirdly handsome. He does have that weird mustache of, like, I've never been a fan of, like, your sideburns connect and go up and over your upper lip and then all the way back over again. It's sort of like not a chin strap, but it's like a mustache strap, and I've never liked it.
I would say this is a very rakish kind of a look.
He's got a rakish vibe, for sure. Yeah. And he has a normal size tie on, which I think he's doing a good job of doing. Dr. Crichton's potential hotness aside, he confirmed that she was in fact pregnant at the time of the murder in December of 1892 and that she had been physically ill and in danger of miscarriage, which finally occurred at the end of January 1893, so just about a month later. Though the court was satisfied with the doctor's testimony, most newspapers speculated that she was faking it. So sorry, this is like a hard right turn into talking about women's health and miscarriage. But Ursula had for her legal defense attorney Samuel Henry Piles, which I think isn't Piles like a euphemism for hemorrhoids? Yeah.
Yes, it is.
Wow. But the judge presiding over the case was Thomas Jefferson Humes, who looks exactly like Mark Twain. Right. I can't wait to share these pictures because this guy is just, you're like, oh, that's Mark Twain. It's like, no, that is Thomas Jefferson Humes. Humes later served as mayor, and he was considered pretty lenient about vice. So that was the judge. Things got underway in late March of 1893, various papers commenting on her appearance in her morning attire. The murderess of Thomas Henderson Boyd was in court yesterday and charged with murder in the first degree. Although dressed in deep mourning, she seemed to be perfectly calm. She did plead not guilty. After her hearing, she was released on $5,000 bail, causing a fresh round of outrage commentary. The Tacoma Daily called it a legal farce, saying it was a gross outrage on public justice that this woman should be today practically a free woman. The Yakima Herald said Ursula Unfug, the attractive siren who shot and killed Thomas Henderson Boyd, captured the prosecuting attorney of King County and all other court officials with her witcheries and is now out on $5,000 bail. This is a premium on other courtesans becoming proficient and active in the use of the revolver. I think this is frustrating, and I just have to take a little pause and say...
The witchy ways!
Like, she's like, yeah, this treatment that if a woman is put out on bail, or that she somehow cast a spell over people. Another just really interesting one was that the Aberdeen Herald brought up the recent acquittal of Lizzie Borden, to put this into some historical context, and commented on Ursula. They said that the woman now on trial in Seattle is charged with as cold-blooded a murder as ever disgraced the history of any state or people. Her previous life has been notoriously bad. She has been a harpy who has feasted on corruption and aggravated the festering sores of immorality. Great line.
Jesus.
No reasonable being doubts she deliberately killed Thomas Henderson Boyd.
Yeah, she's
already been prosecuted.
Yeah, prosecuted her. Okay, so in late June of 1893, Ursula took the stand, and the Fairhaven Herald called it a, quote, red letter day for the defense. They commented that Ursula's testimony was given clearly and unhesitatingly, and that her demeanor went far in impressing the jury in her favor. They commented on the evidence in the form of letters written by Boyd that proved one of the greatest sensations of the day throughout the state, and were too pronounced in language for publication. So these letters are like the key to the whole thing. And the Seattle PI went all in with big, full newspaper pages of testimony transcribed, like in that teeny tiny writing.
So they didn't think it was too pronounced for publication.
They redacted a lot of things. There's just like blankety blanks. So you'll have to fill in with your imagined old-timey swear words of choice when we get to those. But so they said, the interest in the trial reached its height yesterday when the accused herself took the stand and told her story, a story which throws a lurid light on the life of the dead man, and his slayer is hideous in its details. So, content warning again, because we are going to get into some descriptions of domestic violence.
So if you have a hard time with descriptions of violence in general or domestic violence, I would skip forward a little bit ahead.
When Ursula took the stand, they said in the newspaper, her bearing was quiet, composed, and ladylike. She spoke in a low but distinct tone. Her answers were ready and direct, and her language was devoid of exaggerations. At times she hesitated and cast down her eyes when casting about for a mild word with which to express horrid details. So she is really being like a model
She was well
witness.
coached, yeah.
Yeah. She told this long, sordid story, submitting evidence of their marriage. She produces a Bible in which the record of their marriage is written in Boyd's handwriting, and apparently there were also blood spots on it. So she said that was because they had been having one of their fights, and he had beaten her head on the floor, and she got a bloody lip. And then to make it up to her, he's like, I'll marry you right now, basically, and writes it in the Bible, and she's like, I love you so much, and kisses the Bible with her bloody lips.
Ugh.
So she also described an incident that occurred in Fairhaven when Boyd had come to town to visit her, and he sent a note to her in the brothel asking her to come see him at his hotel, but she explained that he hadn't signed his name to the note, so she didn't pay any attention to it. And so because she didn't answer, he showed up at the brothel, and in her words, as quoted in the paper, he was very much intoxicated and in a great rage because I had not gone to the hotel at his bidding or answered his note. He tore up my clothing, smashed the furniture, broke up my trunk and toilet set, took all the money I had, threw me on the bed, choked me, and tried to smother me with a pillow. The row woke up the whole house, and the landlady came up and threatened to have Boyd arrested.
Which, she's working in a brothel. He's coming in. It's interesting to me that the madam of the brothel is threatening to call the police, and that kind of shows a different time and place, too, that there was more ability to call on the police in that system, in which something we've talked about before is just what a different system it was. So in the trial, they get to these letters, and the prosecution is objecting to them naturally, but they are shared. I'm going to give a little bit more of a sample. So these are letters that Tom wrote to Ursula. Dear Ursie, how can I apologize to you? My conduct yesterday was not only shameful, but humiliating. I telegraphed to you from Port Townsend, but you evidently thought I was full. That full means drunk. You were mistaken. For the moment I saw the wharf recede at Fairhaven, I recovered my senses. I have not drank since, but the fact is, kitten, you are drifting from me. The thought makes me wild. Yesterday I drank because I caught you in a falsehood. I was weak to do it, but I love you. I am sick in bed today and have telegraphed you for $20. Work Emerson for a couple of $1,000. I think you can. Your poor boy, Tom. P.S. I am awfully ashamed, kitten. If you were here, I could prove it to you. This letter is nuts. It's like classic abuser stuff. It's classic drunk stuff where you're like, I'm never doing it again, ever, ever, ever. Anyway, he's like, I'm so sorry, baby. Anyway, could you send me $20? And also... Jesus. And then also, can you work that Emerson guy for a couple of $1,000? Like, wow, you're really up in that game. He's literally just beat the crap out of her, broken all of her stuff, and is immediately like, I need you to send me some money, okay? Cause. So he wanted her to try to work Emerson for money, who was the proprietor of that Tontine saloon that we talked about. This is like a common theme with him. So most of the time, it's like he's using her sex work and encouraging her sex work and using the fact that she's a sex worker to try to bribe other people. So, ruin their lives by saying that she's had sex with them. Anyway, so then he goes and gets like crazy jealous in some instances, and that's that thing of like putting her into sex work and then being jealous about her being in sex work. So we're going to see themes of that. Yeah. So we also have this letter. Dear little woman, you're constantly in my thoughts, and oftentimes, kitten, my thoughts are not the purest. But then my love for you is not the less strong, and I would sooner see you dead than know those dear arms were ever around another's neck. It's like, dude, you're literally asking her to send you $20. How do you think she's going to get it? I know every act of your future life will be such as to atone for those done in the past. You have in you every element of good, which had they been fostered and nurtured, would have not let you do wrong. God bless you, little girl. I have been very cruel to you many times in the past 10 months, but I have learned within that time to appreciate your worth. Then I too shall make the future atone for the past. Do not forget your prayers and daily read a chapter in the Bible. Read it not hastily, but carefully, and in time you will become more than worthy to become the wife of Tom Boyd. Oh my God, gross.
Yeah.
He's telling her, like, you're going to get to the point.
Yeah.
You're going to get to the promised land.
He's playing on her shame of being a sex worker. Okay, so there were also some letters that involved some pretty salacious insults at Colonel Vischer, the Fairhaven editor. Tom, in one letter, called him a poor old imbecile with a face that makes me vomit when I look at it. If I were a woman, I would have to be pretty hard up to ask him for money, but nevertheless turns right around and asks her to work him for money.
Have sex with this man and then tell his wife. Or get this guy to write you a letter, maybe, telling you how beautiful he thinks you are, and then tell his wife.
Or be like, if you don't, I'm going to go tell your wife, all this kind of stuff.
Or publish it in a paper or whatever,
So, and there's lots of letters where he details, like, I'm going to send you a letter under these secret names with instructions, and he pre-writes letters for her that he's written, but he wants her to send as if she's written them to various men. And so those are, like, in these letters also. So there's just tons of very damning evidence.
And those are for extortion
letters. Yeah. And there was even one to May Wright, her own madam.
That's not going to go well.
It just seems like he's very desperate for money, which again makes me wonder if he's, like, in the cocaine tooth drops or something. Like, what is going on with this guy?
Yeah, and we don't know how many of them she sent, but...
So then Ursula explained he had asked her, aside from all these letters and things, he said, well, go to Spokane and start a house of ill fame there and send me money. And so then that provides context for the next letters, in which he says, quote, "My dear Ursie, I have but one letter from you since you left. The one written the night you arrived in Spokane. I do not understand your silence. I allowed you to go away from me this time to assist me. If you see that you cannot do this, when you receive this, then I would suggest your coming back. I am surprised at your visiting any man's rooms after all the oaths you took. Your husband," in all caps.
So he sent her out there to start a brothel, and he's mad at the idea that she might be working in a brothel. Got it. Cool.
And then he says, "Now, my dear, what I want you to do is this. Immediately after all meals, I wish you to enter your room and there remain as long as there is a man in the house. For God's sake, be a little prouder and more circumspect. I need not speak plainer. Remember, I will find out. Your Tom." So it's weird because I think he wants her to, like, be the madam, essentially. Don't sleep with any men.
Don't be a sex worker.
Yeah.
Just go and but then he's also, he knows it sounds like he's spinning out.
Yes.
And whether she is or isn't, he's decided that she has.
Yes.
And he's saying, I'll find out.
Yes.
Because,
so that's very weird and creepy also. And then he says, "You must, kitten, start that house and rake off $10,000 before the election in November." He says, "I have faith in you and want you to retain it in me. I miss you. I love you. I trust you. God bless you. Remember what I have made you. Your own Tom."
Oof. It takes a lot of money to extort a lot of money.
Yeah, I guess. And save his newspaper that he's probably drank away. But so during all this, the papers are reporting, like, the crowd in the courtroom, they're frequently unable to restrain, their expressions of sympathy with Ursula and also contempt for the dead man. So all of these letters being read out loud are just really turning the tide in everyone's like, this guy's a real fucking dick. Okay, then Mr. Piles, the attorney, he announced that the next set of letters are going to be particularly bad, and the court actually took a recess. And then the PI did print these, like I said, heavily expurgated in their terms.
With blankety blanks?
Yeah. So this one says, "My Ursie, I call you this, though I shall not if you do not prove to me that you are of a metal that I have not yet as seen." I'm going to insert a bad word here, like asshole.
Bastards.
Bastard.
It's old-timey bad word.
Yeah. "A Fairhaven man here tells me that during that bastard's illness you were wont to make up nice little dishes of fruits to bring him. Is this so? If you have honor, I now place you on it and demand of you tell the truth. Did you do it? Did you ever take to him anything? I have long been suspicious why you did not write to that bastard, as I demanded you to do 10 months ago. Now I demand of you to go down to Fairhaven and give him what you have given me, a dishonest name.
I just have to point out that this is the letter that they took a break before because it had 3 blanketies and it had 3 blanks, which maybe were bastard. Maybe they were worse words. Yeah. Really scandalous. Maybe it was a C word. Who knows? It could be anything. But, like, that's what they're taking the pause for. But I would argue that these descriptions of how he's, like, brutally manipulating her are way harder to listen to. Like, I'm like, oh, okay, you know. And I just think it's interesting. Just, like, the sensibilities of the time are fascinating.
How scandalous it was to say sweary words, cursey words. And Boyd accuses her of lying about various things, and then he concludes this letter with, quote, "If I wrong you now, I apologize abjectly. If I do not, I take nothing back. Let me see about your bastard lover. You have money. THB." And then on the bottom, just because he couldn't let it go, he writes more again about the fruit.
Right.
And he's like, when I was sick, you allowed me to starve. And then again, he asks her for money. So I'm just like,
how about that $20 that Dr. Brown owed you? Is that what it says now?
Yeah.
It's crazy because it's like anyone who's been around someone who's this level of an abuser knows that, like, they will get so fixated on some aspect like this. Like, you brought him fruit.
Yeah.
You brought him a little plate of fruits over to his house. And it's like, well, I'm sorry. Wasn't I supposed to go over there and try to, like, seduce him? Have sex with him, get him to write me a letter, and then, like, send it to his wife? Did you think I'm like, and you're obsessed with the fruit that I brought him? It's just so telling and fascinating.
Very crazy. All right, so more letters in the same vein followed with more curse words and the same topics. I mean, it went on and on. The jealousy, the obsession, the loving promises of, like, trips he was going to take her on. There were letters with listing names of men he wanted her to seduce and blackmail. So obviously this is all very damning evidence. He sounds honestly unhinged.
Yeah. And so for this next section, I just want to do another content warning about suicidal thoughts. So skip forward if that's going to be rough for you. So also in the trial is included letters from Ursula to Tom. So here's a sample of those. "Forgive me if I accused you wrongfully in my letter. If you think I had no reason to write as I did, why, I shall accept my punishment meekly. I am so unhappy. When you are with me and kind to me, I am a perfect ecstasy of bliss. But when you are away and unkind, I suffer such torture, I am often tempted to end all by blowing my brains out. Forgive me, Tom, for writing this way, but I am so miserable. Why are you not kinder to me? Do you not realize I am not long for this world? What good can we derive from separating a poor old woman and child from her husband and father? Although, if you so much wish it, I will do it. God knows I am not wicked and cruel, and I thoroughly despise such a way of taking revenge. But he will not punish me for it. It will be you. I am afraid for you, and I love you, and cannot bear the thoughts of your suffering. If you still wish this, Tom, why, so help me God, I will soon do it. Remember, I'm your wife, and in no way would I allow your name implicated in this affair. I'm so sorry we cannot bury this matter once and for all time. Obediently, your wife." This is so hard to square with the description of the woman earlier who is, like, running people down and trying to stab them. I mean, again, there's a possibility that if those accounts are true, that she was in alcoholic rage, that she was drunk out of her mind. But, like, this also just feels so heartbreaking in the sense that she is talking about just that when we're together and things are good, it's so great. But when you're upset with me, it's so terrible. And, like, I really don't want to try to go ruin this Fisher guy's life. And I don't understand why you want me to do this. If it's what you say it's going to make you happy, then I'll do it. I think it's almost like she's basically pleading or bargaining. Can we be happy again after this? Yeah. And it's just hard to read. And it sounds to me like someone who is desperate for things to just go back to how they were.
Sure.
Yeah.
It's also crazy, too, because, like, a lot of women who worked as sex workers ended up, like, getting married and just going on to live normal lives. Like, that was one way that some people got out of the life. But he's a very different level of man, I would guess.
He's not trying to help her get out of this life at all. He's trying to use her access to this life to his own ends.
Yeah, but I think that's kind of what she's hoping is, like, I'll just end up being, like, this guy's wife and, like, he'll support me.
But yeah, so some other testimony included Ursula describing incidents where he burned her with a cigar and threatened her with a knife. She described a lot of other schemes and escapades where he sent her to go get money. She stated, "Mr. Boyd was only kind when I gave him money." He would beat, choke, and pinch me and cover my body with bruises. At this point, Mrs. Boyd's voice trembled and her eyes were suffused with tears. He rarely ever sent money to me. I sent a good deal of money to him. Ursula then was asked about and gave her description of the day of the murder. Mr. Boyd, she said, came to Seattle about noon that day. When he came to the house, I was just rising from the lunch table when I saw Mr. Boyd coming up the steps. I went to meet him and he kissed me, and I returned his kiss. Then he went into our room. He said he was very tired and wanted to take some rest. She described how she went out, and when she came back to the room, she brought up the baby that she was carrying because she was pregnant. And he said, if it doesn't look like me, I will disown it. If it has any good qualities, it will get them from me. It won't get any from you. If it's a girl, it will be just like you. It will be a damn whore, just like you have been. So Ursula says, I told him I was much hurt about what he said and did not say anything for several seconds. Then he said he was hungry and wanted me to get him some clothes so he could go downtown and get something to eat. It's just nuts. It's like, oh, anyway, can you do another thing for me after I said this terrible thing to you? She apparently noticed some holes in his clothing and sat down and began to mend them. And he said, Kitten, did you ever darn anybody else's socks? And Ursula replied that perhaps she had. And he said, you have you? And then he began using some really abusive language. He asked if she had written the blackmail letters he told her to write, and she said she hadn't yet. And he went out and came back later at like 5 o'clock. They had planned to go to the theater, and he had her get her dinner and eat it in the room, and he said more jealous things. So he wouldn't even let her go eat down at the table with everybody else. She had to bring it up with her. So it says she fed him bites of food, and he asked her if she ever fed Ashton like this, her former lover. And again, he brought up the letters and threatened her about it, and she said she wasn't going to do it. And so when she said she wasn't going to write the letters after all that treatment of her by him, he leaped up, she says, at my throat. I turned away from him, and he struck me in the back of the neck, throwing me over against the wall and making my nose bleed and nearly upsetting the washstand. He then threw me on the floor, put his knee on my breast, and cried out, I'll make you write those letters, you devil, damn you. Someone knocked on the door, and he let me up with my hair and clothing in disorder. He went out about 7 o'clock. I was expecting him to come back and take me to the theater. He did not come, and I got very anxious and went down and found him. She found him and convinced him to come back to her room with her. He was drunk at that point and in a bad mood, and he brought up the letters again, and they fought some more, and he threatened to blow her brains out. And she testified that he sprang for a revolver lying on the bureau, and I tried to get to it. We scuffled around the room, and the pistol was discharged. I got it away from him and started to run. He was coming for me, and I raised the pistol and fired. He turned half around, and I rushed by him. He came for me again, and I think I shot at him again. I'm not sure. I don't remember anything more until I woke up the next morning in jail, which is very like, he had it coming. Mm-hmm. He had it coming. He only had himself to blame. It's very the movie Chicago, the movie musical Chicago. But the story is backed up by where the bullets were found. So it looks like she shot him, tried to shoot at him twice, runs across the room, shoots 2 more times, and gets him the second 2 times.
The papers reported that though she was subjected to a most rigid cross-examination, but it was impossible to shake her testimony. So she stuck to her stories. Court adjourned, and the jury did deliberate for several hours, and they acquitted her. They acquitted Ursula Unfug Boyd of murder. The verdict was actually greeted with a cheer, and women in the room were said to have burst into tears.
Wow.
So one paper reported, the acquittal of Mrs. Ursula Unfug will be of no surprise to those who have read the testimony. She is not a model woman, or one entitled to any respect in the community, but Boyd proved himself much more debased than she was, and the act which caused her to take his life will be a stain on his memory for all time. And the Fairhaven Herald quipped, Solomon was a wise man, and it was he who wrote that, "Oh, that mine enemy would write a book. If the late unlamented Thomas Henderson Boyd had not been given to writing letters, his memory today might have been cherished. As it is, well, the man is dead." The Missoulahan remarked, "While the world is better off without Boyd, it would also be better off without women of the Ursula Unfug stripe."
Okay. Useful feedback.
Right. So there's a lot of this similar thing, they're saying, we'll just go and meet another man that's maybe, a better man than Boyd, and what's to stop her from just doing it again?
Right. What's to stop her from being horribly abused by another man until she's forced,
God.
until she's in a situation where it's him or her. It's crazy how much women were expected to put up with at this time in history.
Yeah.
You know, of course, murder, and not to take that lightly, it's just, this doesn't seem like a situation that there was, one of them seems like they were not going to get out of it alive.
Right. Well, in almost every single incident, which there aren't very many, like there was not even really jails designated for women at this point.
Right.
So the women who were being arrested for murder, it was 100% domestic violence situations.
Yeah, it's a real snapped TV show situation, or like, I feel like there's this tendency in our culture to act like when a woman is a murderer, it's somehow worse because they're supposed to be somehow better.
So she's free, but unfortunately, you know, what are her prospects now? She's notorious for having murdered a man, and she ends up right back where she started, working in brothels again. Of course, papers are gleefully reporting that she's back to her old stomping grounds. She goes to Victoria to a brothel. She was in a San Francisco brothel. She was in a Tucson, Arizona brothel, where it was reported that she had slaked an almost fatal thirst with laudanum.
Oh.
So this is an opiate, but clearly, yeah, she's likely ends up addicted here. She got married in 1899. I found a marriage record for her, but it must not have lasted long. They divorced just a few years later, and that's where the trail goes absolutely cold on Ursula Unfug. So there's always a chance some new document will surface or bring some kind of conclusion to the story, but unfortunately, that is where we're left.
So interesting. It's like there's no winners in these sorts of stories at all. And they're hard to tell. I mean, I think this kind of story is where we get an insight into the lives of sex workers from the time, because it is so sensational. It does really fit into the wider society's ideas of what sex work looked like. And because we often talk about, you know, you said earlier, there were women who did sex work for a while, went on, got married. We know that this isn't like the story, but this is the type of thing that the Penny Dreadful books loved to publish. This is the story that the society types loved. It really just feeds into this notion that it's a terrible life. And yeah, I think that it's a lifestyle that you can really be preyed upon, and you can end up in a really difficult position. So I think it's interesting because we do get a little bit of an insight into what that life looked like. It sounds like if anyone was championing for her at all, it was her madams.
Yeah.
Like the one example in here of someone actually like trying to help her, or it's other women, right?
It is other women.
So it's women, the religious women.
The chambermaids.
Exactly.
The ladies at the trial cheering and weeping.
Right. So, and, you know, someone calling the cops or saying they're going to call the cops on her shitty, abusive husband.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting because that's the thing that we do know, that sex workers really did look out for each other, and that women really ran that system. And dudes like Tom are exactly why the powers that be wanted to keep men out of sex work. That's why we had the anti-pimping statutes that were saying that men could not... They
shall not profit from the earnings of a fallen woman.
Exactly. They couldn't get their...
Finally memorized that.
Money. I love it. They couldn't get their money from a fallen woman. They couldn't... And which you could have... Theoretically, he might have been able to have been prosecuted under, because that's exactly what he was doing. He was basically functioning as her pimp. And so, for listeners that might not know this, there was an anti-pimping statute. It was illegal for men to be making money off of sex workers, and women were absolutely encouraged to be the only people running brothels. Madams were considered to just be better at it for a lot of reasons, and and so you could do things like a madam have like a bodyguard type person, someone who ran the door, kept people safe. They could also have like someone that they paid to play piano, or someone that they paid to do errands, but that was supposed to be a madam's employee. Woman was not supposed to be the employee of a man in the sex industry. So this is a perfect example. It's a very sad story, but it's a perfect example of why that was actually a very prescient and intelligent way to try to make it a better system for women.
Agreed. Well, golly, I don't know if I have anything else to say about this. I mean, it's just, you know, it's the cycle of abuse. It was just alarming to read through all of these, honestly. And it was just like, oh, God, you know, it's such a familiar story, unfortunately, you know. I mean,
and we have language for cycles of violence and cycles of abuse now, so it's so interesting to read this as like such a clear case study of that.
Yes.
But she wouldn't have had that language.
None of that
obviously
would have been
nobody
no support.
Yeah, obviously nobody in authority had that understanding and language of the concept of like how power and control in relationships can lead to these sorts of situations.
I mean, it barely feels like there's support now. Like there's there's a lot of things that still feel lacking.
And when we look at this and we see the sensationalism, the victim blaming, it feels so like they're saying with the quiet part loud, you know, it feels so like in your face. At this point, you know, more than 100 years ago, we're talking about, you know, that just being the predominant culture at the time. And it just was a really hard time to be a woman who was having a hard time.
Yeah. Oh my God.
And we'll never know if Ursula and her mom were in fact hot or not. They were both described at various times as being...
I know, what...
Well, we actually didn't get to it, but her mom was later described when she shows up at the trial.
Oh, that's right.
As being looking like quite a tough nut herself, which is what I thought was...
The first time I saw the drawing, I was actually like, what? Because, yeah, she looks fine, but the way that most of the descriptions of her have been like this ravishing beauty, and I was like, oh.
I have a theory about what a ravishing beauty was out here in the olden times.
Anything.
It was a woman with literally any meat on her bones.
Yes.
With literally any meat on her bones and with a clear complexion. Yeah. That's it. That's all you had to have. And like some boobs.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that was it. Because we see lots of women, all different kinds of photographs of all different kinds of women where they're described as sex workers and often much more buxom, much more curvy than we would expect. That's true. And they are described as beautiful. It's great. I'd love to see it. It's great. You know, but I think that it basically at the time was shorthand for she's not missing any meals. Yeah. And she's got relatively unblemished skin and she's got a cleavage.
I'm like, I don't know if I could do sex work now at my age, in this day and age, you know, like without some enhancements of some sort. But like, I feel like I could go back in time and be killing it still, you know?
Yeah. I know what you mean. Yeah, I feel like the idea that women had to fit some really specific mold. I mean, maybe if you were in a big city, there you could be more choosy back east, but out here, and also like men were looking for comfort. Yeah. But I also just think we, as much as, yes, women were being constantly judged by their appearance, we didn't quite have as narrow of a concept of what attractive was back then as we do now. That's very true. And people didn't see constant images. Like there was, of course, images like the Rainier Beer Girl and, there was images of women who were beautiful being depicted in things, but you didn't see constant images of like perfect looking women and then being told over and over again, this is the only acceptable way to be a woman and be out in the world. Very true. And so at this time it's like, you're 22. You've got a symmetrical face. Let's do this. 100%. Everyone deserves relationships free from domestic violence. If you or somebody you know needs help, please call the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-7233. And also a national suicide hotline is available now at 988.
Thank you, Marissa. And we will put links in our show notes, as usual, to these kinds of resources and a lot of things that we've been referring to, like all the pictures and things. So be sure to check out those show notes at bellinghistory.com. That wraps up our Belling His Story today. We'll be back hopefully every third Thursday with some new episodes. I'm not sure what's coming in the pipeline next, but Marissa and I have some ideas we're working on for some more episodes. So you will hear more from Marissa, and thank you all for listening. Thanks, Marissa.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to come back soon.
It is summertime. We're doing lots of tours. If you find yourself in Bellingham, do check those out. You can come hear more about May Wright and all the sites of these brothels and things that we've been talking about.
Well, hey there, mama, where'd you go? You gotta reap just what you sow. That's too bad. Too bad. To that old time. The old man hicks without bad weather. Put on the side, they were sewn together. That's too bad. To listen to that old time music.
Thank you all for listening to Belling History with the Good Time Girls. If you enjoy this podcast, you can subscribe and review on your favorite podcast platforms. You can check out our show notes at bellinghistory.com. You can find us and follow us on all the social medias.
Oh, Most of the time we just love to see blue, that's too bad. To listen to that old time music.
I lost my hat, I lost my brim, I look like a crow's nest swinging on a limb.
That's too bad. To listen to that old time music.
As always, we'd like to thank Devin Champlin and the late great Lucas Hicks for the use of the Gallus Brothers song, Too Bad West Coast Blues. You can find them and Devin Champlin at Bandcamp, and you can find Devin at Champlin Guitars in downtown Bellingham.
Lost my hat, lost my brim, looking like a crow's nest swinging from a limb. That's too bad, too bad.
Well, I got no bugging, I got no smokes. I look like Grandpap and all of his folks.
That's too bad. To listen to that old time music.
So tune in next time for more Belling history.
Thank you.
Thanks.